Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1: The Scarlet Offering. The first thing that caught his eye was the color. Not the shape, not the size, the color. A sharp, impossible red resting on the dull skin of the sidewalk, like a fresh wound that didn't belong there. Giant Way slowed, then stopped altogether. The street around him felt hollow, emptied out by the hour. One flickering lamp struggled overhead, its light stuttering on and off as if unsure it wanted to keep watch. Each blink reshaped the shadows, making the street feel unfamiliar, almost borrowed from another place. He had been walking aimlessly for a while, the kind of walk you take when going home feels heavier than staying out. 20 minutes earlier, he'd left a small restaurant with the taste of cheap noodles still clinging to his mouth. His last cash had gone into that bowl. He could still feel the heat of the coins in his palm, the way his hands trembled as he counted them out under the owner's tired stare. Now the street was silent, and the envelope lay ahead of him, waiting. He didn't move closer. He didn't move at all. The paper looked wrong for this place, too refined, too deliberate. Even from a distance, he could tell it wasn't something ordinary. Thick stock, smooth edges. The kind of envelope meant to be held with care, not dropped on concrete. Gold lettering traced the front in elegant strokes, catching the light for half a second before slipping back into shadow, unreadable but unmistakably formal. A red envelope. His chest tightened. Stories surfaced immediately, uninvited. Old afternoons in a dim apartment, the smell of tea leaves. His grandmother's voice lowered just enough to make every word feel dangerous. She used to say some things were never lost by accident. Some things were placed. Red envelopes left alone at night weren't gifts. They were calls, tests, bargains made by hands you couldn't see. He swallowed and glanced down the empty street. No footsteps, no engines. Just the soft electrical buzz of the lamp and his own breathing, suddenly loud in his ears. He knew what he was supposed to do. Keep walking, step around it, pretend he never noticed. Go back to the cramped apartment where 3 men slept on thin mattresses and unspoken regrets. Wake up before sunrise. Put on the same worn jacket. Carry his degree from office to office while strangers looked past his words and straight into his hunger. That was the safe path, the sensible one. But the envelope didn't look dangerous. It looked patient. A thought slipped in, quiet and tempting. Red envelopes held money, sometimes real money, sometimes enough to change things, even if only for a little while. He imagined rent paid on time. A full meal without counting bites. A day where hope didn't feel like an irresponsible luxury. The light flickered again, and for a moment the gold characters seemed to glow, as if acknowledging him. Giant Way felt himself standing at a line he hadn't known existed. One step forward meant admitting the stories might be true. One step away meant accepting that tomorrow would look exactly like today. The street stayed silent. The envelope waited. His grandmother had warned him about this part as well. She used to say that miracles did happen, but they always arrived dragging a cost behind them, when you only understood after it was too late. The wind suddenly swept through the street, sharp and cold, nudging the envelope so it scraped softly across the pavement. Giant's pulse skipped. For a split second, it didn't look like chance. The red shape edged closer to his shoes, slow and deliberate, as if responding to him. He jerked backward, breath caught in his throat, then immediately felt foolish. It was just paper, just ink. The dead, he told himself, only had as much power as the living surrendered. Steeling his nerves, he crouched and lifted the envelope. Warm. That was wrong. It shouldn't have been warm at all. The night air was cold, the concrete colder still, yet the envelope rested in his hand with an unsettling heat, almost like it had been held moments ago. The surface felt indulgent, smooth, soft, faintly pliant, nothing like ordinary stationery. It reminded him uncomfortably of human skin cared for with money and time. He tilted it toward the street lamp. The gold lettering sharpened into focus and his breath hitched. The words were formal, ancient in tone, written in a style so old it felt out of place in this century. Not a name, not a greeting. A designation. For the bridegroom. His fingers began to shake. He'd expected cash or worse, a cruel prank, fake bills meant to mock people desperate enough to hope. This was something else entirely. A message like that implied ritual, commitment, a bond that didn't end once the money was spent. He could still stop. He could put it back exactly where it was, step away, convince himself this night had never happened. Forget the warmth, forget the writing, forget the unease creeping up his spine. But the envelope seemed alive in his grasp, faintly throbbing in time with his pulse. The gold characters shimmered at the edge of his vision, never quite staying still. And then his thoughts betrayed him. His empty wallet, the dull ache in his stomach, the long stretch of days ahead that all looked the same. His hand moved before his mind finished arguing. He slipped a finger beneath the seal and opened it. Inside were fresh bills, crisp and unmistakably real. Not ceremonial paper, not illusions, actual money. He counted quickly, almost afraid it would vanish if he hesitated. 5,000 yuan, more than he'd held in months. Enough to breathe, enough to delay desperation, enough to believe just for a moment that his life might bend in a new direction. He closed the envelope and tucked it inside his jacket. It pressed against his chest, heavy and warm, like a second heart beating too close to his own. The street felt different now, emptier, yet charged. The silence pressed in from all sides. Shadows between the buildings seemed thicker, deeper, as if something unseen had leaned forward to watch him walk away. Dense and watchful, like it was holding its breath for him. Giant hurried home, his steps sharp and hurried against the pavement. The sound of his shoes felt louder than it should have been, each echo chasing him down the street. The envelope thudded softly against his chest with every stride, not heavy, but impossible to forget. It reminded him again and again that something had shifted, that a choice had been made, whether he understood it or not. By the time he reached his building and climbed the narrow stairwell to the apartment he shared, exhaustion dulled the edges of his fear. He almost laughed at himself. Hunger did strange things to the mind. Fatigue twisted reality. Maybe none of it had been real. But when he checked his jacket, the envelope was still there. Warm, solid, full. He lay down on his thin mattress in the dark, listening to his roommate's slow, even breathing fill the room. Sleep refused to come. The jacket hung from a nail beside his bed, and though his eyes were closed, he could feel the envelope's presence as clearly as if it were resting on his chest. Now and then, the paper shifted faintly against the fabric, producing a sound so subtle it might have been imagined, except it never stopped. Morning arrived without relief. The money was still inside when he checked, crisp, undeniably real, yet the apartment felt wrong. The air carried a strange weight as though the room had been quietly rearranged while everyone slept. When Giant brushed his teeth, he paused at the sink. In the mirror, his reflection stared back as expected, tired eyes, hollow cheeks. But behind it, just for an instant, something darker slid across the glass. A shape that moved half a heartbeat out of sync with him. He looked again, nothing. He used the money to buy a proper breakfast, the first in weeks, then wandered the city for hours. He told himself he was job hunting, but in truth he was studying his own shadow in shop windows, listening to his footsteps, trying to decide whether he was still the same man who had walked home last night. The envelope had changed something. Whether it was a gift or a sentence, he couldn't yet tell. The answer came after sunset. When he returned to his building, 3 figures stood waiting in the narrow hallway. They were dressed in black from head to toe, their clothing immaculate, tailored, and subtly out of time, fashioned with a formality no one wore anymore. An elderly man stood at the center. On one side was a middle-aged woman, her posture rigid, her expression calm but unreadable. On the other stood a younger man, close enough to her to suggest blood ties. Their faces were pale, their expressions solemn, as though they had arrived not to greet him, but to conclude something already decided. The older man spoke first, his voice steady and final. "You are Jian Wei." It wasn't phrased as a question. Jian felt his throat tighten as he answered, "Yes," even as a quiet certainty settled in his chest. Whatever the envelope had begun, this was the next step, and there would be no turning back now. Barely louder than a breath. "Who are you?" The elderly man inclined his head, the gesture polite yet heavy with meaning. "My name is Fun Gui," he said calmly. "This is my wife Melling and our son Feng Hao." He gestured to the figures beside him. "We've come regarding our daughter." "I don't know your daughter," Jian replied. Even as he said it, heat bloomed in his pocket. The envelope pulsed, unmistakably alive. "You do now," Fun Gui answered without hesitation. "You received her invitation. You accepted her offering. By your actions, you consented." The hallway seemed to shrink as his words landed. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. Doors lining the corridor stayed shut, but Jian could sense the presence behind them. Neighbors frozen in place, listening, afraid to intervene in something that no longer belonged to the ordinary world. "I don't understand," Jian said, though his chest tightened with the sick certainty that he understood far more than he wanted to. "Our daughter Lin passed away 3 years ago," Melling said quietly. When she spoke, the air itself seemed to bend. "Her spirit has not found peace. She cannot walk alone beyond this world." Feng Hao stepped forward slightly. "She requires a companion." Jian's lips parted. "The envelope," he whispered. "Not merely payment," Feng Hao replied, his expression unreadable. "It was a covenant. You accepted it freely. You opened it. You counted it. You kept it. That is how agreements are sealed." The floor seemed to tilt. Jian grabbed the wall to steady himself, his pulse roaring in his ears. "I didn't know what it meant. I never agreed to this." Fun Gui's gaze hardened. Ignorance does not undo consequence. Consent is shown through choice, not intention. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. "You have 3 days," Fun Gui continued. "Prepare yourself. On the 3rd night, the ceremony will be completed. Our daughter will come for you, and you will walk with her beyond the boundary of the living." "No," Jian said, but the word collapsed as soon as it left him. "I won't. I'll return the money." Melling shook her head slowly. "The money is only a symbol. The bond has already been formed." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, something like pity flickered across her face. "Even now, Lin is reaching for you. Each hour brings her closer." As if summoned by the thought, a fragrance seeped into the hallway. Sweet jasmine layered with something darker beneath it, warm, cloying, wrong. Incense, perhaps, or decay. Giant's vision swam. The lights above flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he felt another presence behind him, close enough to breathe, close enough to touch. For a heartbeat, he was certain there was someone else standing with them. A fourth shape lingered just behind the family. A young woman draped in white, her outline faint, her face swallowed by shadow. She stood perfectly still, close enough that he felt her presence more than saw it. Then his vision snapped back into focus. The hallway was empty. No black clothing, no solemn faces, no strangers from another world, just peeling paint, buzzing lights, and the familiar smells of dinner drifting from beneath closed doors. Ordinary life, continuing as if nothing had happened. Except the jasmine. The scent clung stubbornly to the air, and the envelope in his pocket felt heavier than before, as though it had absorbed the weight of what had been said. Giant staggered into his apartment. His roommates sat on the floor, eating and watching television, their laughter low and distracted. They glanced up at him, nodding his pallor and trembling hands with casual concern. "You look awful," one of them said. "You sick or something?" "No," Giant replied. It was the only answer he could manage. Just tired. He retreated to his corner and collapsed onto his mattress, dragging the thin blanket over his head like a shield. The envelope rustled softly against his chest. The scent followed him, filling the cramped space until it felt impossible to breathe. He tried to think logically. Authorities, contracts, proof. Surely there was someone who could explain this away. But in his gut, he already knew. Laws written by the living meant nothing where he had crossed. The envelope hadn't been a gift, it had been an entrance, and he had stepped through it willingly. Sleep came in fragments. In his dreams, a woman stood at the foot of his bed, dressed in pale fabric that moved as if stirred by an unseen breeze. Her eyes held a sorrow so deep it felt endless. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence pressed heavier than words. He could smell jasmine, hear the faint slide of silk, feel the room bending around her presence. When he jolted awake in the dead of night, his heart raced. For one terrifying moment, he thought he could still see her, her outline shimmering near the window, thin and unreal, like heat rising from stone. The second day broke him. The scent followed him everywhere, but it was no longer gentle. The sweetness had soured, twisted into something foul. Flowers left too long in water, beauty decomposing into rot. When he found himself alone, which seemed to happen constantly now, the air thickened until it felt solid. Invisible pressure pinned him down. Hands he couldn't see closed around his throat, restrained his wrists, crushed his chest with deliberate force. Nothing in the apartment behaved the way it should. His reflection betrayed him, lagging behind his movements just enough to make his stomach turn. Books opened themselves to pages that vanished when he tried to focus, revealing lines of unfamiliar handwriting that disappeared the moment he blinked. Clothes weren't dropped. They were ripped from hangers and flung aside, arranged in mocking piles as if someone wanted him to notice. By the end of the day, Giant understood the truth with sickening clarity. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was already with him. Formed the unmistakable silhouette of a human body sprawled across the floor. But the sounds were worse than anything he saw. Deep in the night, when the building fell completely silent, a sharp, violent crack would split the darkness, the sound of ceramic shattering against something hard. It came again and again, always followed by a woman's scream that ended too suddenly, as if cut off mid-breath. Every time he rushed to investigate, he found nothing broken. No shards, no mess. Yet the noise stayed with him, vibrating through his bones long after the silence returned. Slowly, dread settled into understanding. These weren't hauntings meant to frighten him. They were memories. He was reliving the final moments of Lynn's life, experiencing the terror she had felt when her father's fury crossed a line that could never be undone. Cold bloomed on his skin without warning, precise and deliberate. The chill wrapped around his throat, clamped his wrists, brushed the back of his neck with the intimate pressure of lifeless fingers. He woke each morning marked by bruises he couldn't explain, dark impressions shaped disturbingly like hands. Then came the smell. Old blood flooded his senses so powerfully it made him gag, sending him retching to the sink. His roommates noticed nothing. That somehow was the most horrifying part. They laughed, cooked, slept, and complained about work as if the world hadn't shifted off its axis. When Giant tried to explain, careful at first, then increasingly desperate, they stared at him with worried eyes, the kind reserved for someone unraveling. He tried to rid himself of the money. He went to temples. He sought out charities. Each time something stopped him, his hands stiffened, his pulse spiked. Excuses spilled from his mouth before he could stop them. Just one more day, just a little longer. The truth crept in slowly, then all at once. The envelope didn't just bind Lynn to him. It bound him to it. That night sleep abandoned him entirely. What came instead were visions so vivid they erased the line between waking and dreaming. Lynn appeared again, but she was no longer the quiet, mournful figure he'd seen before. Panic distorted her face. Desperation pulled at her features. Her white dress was stained with something dark, blood, shadow, or both. She tried to speak. Nothing came out. Only the roar of wind and distant, echoing screams. Behind her stood a man, tall, imposing, his presence radiating a violence so intense the air around him seemed to ripple. His eyes were empty pits, black and bottomless, tugging at Giant's thoughts, dragging him toward a place where mercy had never existed. When Giant snapped awake, his heart hammering, he found jasmine petals scattered across his pillow. Not imagined, not symbolic, but real, resting against his skin like proof that the boundary he'd crossed was no longer behind him. Ground into his hair, packed beneath his fingernails, dissolving on his tongue with a sweetness so thick it made him gag. He spat frantically, scrubbing his mouth raw, but the flavor clung to him, sickly and inescapable. That was when the truth finally settled in. Sleep and waking were no longer separate places. Whatever was touching him could reach him anywhere. The third day did not arrive quietly. People began to find him. Not the family this time, but others, faces from the edges of his life, neighbors he barely recognized, shopkeepers who had never learned his name before, complete strangers who spoke to him as if they'd been expecting him. They offered guidance in hushed voices and sidelong glances, advice that ranged from grounded to unhinged. At the market, an elderly woman pressed vegetables into his hands and whispered, "Go to the temple. Burn incense for the girl. Respect calm's restless spirits." At a bus stop, a young man appeared beside him and said without introduction, "Leave the city. Distance breaks some bonds, not all but some." Later, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and too many rings leaned close and murmured, "You've been chosen. The dead don't only take, they give if you're brave enough." None of it mattered. Giant understood now that running was impossible, hiding was pointless. The moment his fingers closed around the envelope, the path had been set. The jasmine scent saturated everything, his clothes, his food, the air in his lungs. Objects shifted when he wasn't looking. Sounds crept through empty rooms, half-formed and aching like sobs dragged through walls. As dusk bled into night, his feet carried him back without conscious thought. The street. It looked unchanged, yet utterly different, charged, significant, as if the city itself had been holding this place in reserve. No mark remained where the envelope had rested, but the space hummed with unseen force, a quiet pulse beneath the concrete. He stood there as darkness settled, watching the streetlight flicker in the same uncertain rhythm he remembered. Cars passed. People walked by, absorbed in their lives. The city breathed around him. And yet he felt apart from it. Detached, weightless, as if he already belonged somewhere else. "You returned," a voice said softly behind him. Jayan turned. Lynn stood within the circle of yellow light, no longer transparent, no longer wavering. She was solid, real, dressed in a white kippah that shimmered faintly as though lit from within. Up close, her beauty was overwhelming, but not warm. It was the flawless stillness of polished stone, of something meant to last forever. "I didn't have a choice," Jayan said. The calm in his voice surprised him. Lynn stepped closer, her movements smooth and unhurried. "There is always a choice," she replied gently. "Some are simply too heavy to refuse." And as the streetlight flickered above them, Jayan understood that the final decision was no longer waiting in the envelope. It was waiting in him. She lifted her hand and pressed it against his cheek, warm, soft, utterly alive. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice carrying both relief and sorrow. Waiting for someone who could see beyond the fear, someone who could understand. "Understand what?" Jayan asked, though a part of him wished he hadn't. "That I am not your enemy," Lynn replied, her eyes searching his. "That I never wanted this any more than you did. We are both trapped by the same lies, the same cruelty, the same need for others to suffer so that the guilty can feel absolved." Her hand stayed on his face. He could smell the jasmine clinging to her, catch the flecks of gold dancing in her dark eyes, feel the steady pulse of her breathing. She was more real than the street beneath his feet, more tangible than the air he inhaled. I don't understand," he admitted. "You will," she said, and her smile was heavy with sadness, with knowing, with a compassion so deep it hurt. "But first, you must listen. You must decide whether to trust what I tell you or continue to believe what my family told you." Her fingers found his, intertwining with his own, and the world around them began to dissolve. The street, the lamplight, the ordinary city sounds, all faded into a soft haze. When the air cleared, they stood somewhere entirely different. A traditional courtyard house, walls painted red, eaves curling like ancient whispers. Perfectly beautiful, but deeply wrong, as if it existed somewhere between memory and nightmare. "This is where I lived," Lynn said, motioning to the courtyard. "Where I felt happiness, where I fell in love with a man my father despised, and where I died." The courtyard smelled of jasmine, but beneath it lurked a darker, fouler scent. Old blood, rage left to rot, the kind of hatred that had seeped into stone and air alike. Jayan's stomach turned. "Tell me," he said, voice trembling, unsure if he even wanted the answer. "My father was a traditional man," Lynn explained. "He believed in honor, duty, in absolute control. When I told him I wanted to marry for love, not convenience, he was furious. When I said I would run, he raged. And when I actually tried to leave..." She gestured at the courtyard stones, and he finally saw the truth. Dark stains marred the beautiful ground, shadows twisting as if remembering the violence that had soaked into them. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy. A sound screaming, or perhaps whined through empty rooms, echoed faintly in his mind. He killed me, Lynn said simply. Her voice was calm, almost detached, but every word cut through him. My own father. He killed me to protect his honor, to preserve his control, to ensure I would never shame the family. He took my life to hold power over what he could no longer command. Family name. And when my spirit refused to settle, when his guilt curdled into fear and began to poison him, he chose another solution. The ghost marriage, Giant breathed. Yes, Lynn said softly, but not as he described it to you. He claimed it would give me peace, that it would ease my loneliness. That lie was meant for the living. Her gaze hardened. The ritual he performed was older, crueler. It was crafted to shift spiritual consequence, to pass the weight of his crime onto someone innocent. The courtyard trembled. The air thickened, pressing against Giant's mind like a storm building just beyond sight. The jasmine fragrance grew overpowering, yet beneath it throbbed rot, blood, and old violence that refused to fade. Your father's spirit, Giant said slowly, the truth clicking into place. He's trapped by what he did, driven mad by guilt, but instead of facing it, he redirected it. Yes, Lynn replied. The ritual bound me to you, but more importantly, it pointed his rage at you instead of himself. You were meant to carry what he could not, his shield, his sacrifice. Then why are you here? Giant asked. Her expression softened, and for the first time, something like resolve shone through the sorrow. Because he miscalculated. Love does not decay the way guilt does. Truth does not weaken with time. She met his eyes steadily. I would rather stand against him than allow another innocent life to be destroyed for his comfort. The courtyard began to dissolve, its edges blurring like ink in water. But before it vanished completely, Giant saw him. A tall figure lurking near the wall, half swallowed by shadow. His face was contorted with rage and fear. When his eyes locked onto Giant, a hatred so pure surged through him that Giant's legs nearly gave out. He knows, Lynn said quietly as the world shifted back to the street. He knows I warned you. The city returned around them, but it felt thinner now, more fragile. He will stop hiding, she continued. The whispers, the disturbances, that was restraint. Now he will try to take you fully, to pull you into the dead realm and use you as his refuge. Then how do I stop him? Giant asked. You cannot fight him, Lynn said. He is beyond reason, beyond mercy, beyond defeat in the ways you understand. Then what can I do? She stepped closer, her voice lowering. You can reveal him. Reveal him how? Lynn's eyes softened with something achingly human. Through the one truth he could never erase, she said. Through love, through the man I loved, the man I chose. The man I was planning to flee with when my father ended my life. He still lives, still in Beijing, still carrying what happened to me. Jian felt his pulse quicken. Where can I find him? His name is Wen Tao, Lin said. He works as a calligrapher in the Dongcheng district near the old Confucian temple. He writes wedding invitations and funeral notices, joining beginnings and endings with the same hand. Her voice softened. He has been waiting for someone to ask about me. Then why hasn't he spoken before? Jian asked. Because my family silenced him, she replied. Because they are powerful and he feared for those he loves. He has carried the truth quietly, believing silence was the only way to protect his own blood. Her gaze sharpened. But if you go to him as someone already touched by my father's spirit, if you show him that the danger is real, he will listen. The street around them grew clearer, the city pushing its way back into focus. Yet Jian could feel it. the looming presence of Lynn's father closing in, a suffocating pressure that made his skin prickle and his lungs burn. Go tomorrow, Lynn urged. Tell him everything. Show him the envelope. He will recognize it. Ask him to stand with you before the authorities and speak the truth of my death. Once the truth is spoken openly, the bond will break. And if he refuses? Giant asked. Her answer was immediate, unflinching. Then you will die. My father's spirit will claim you and drag you into the dead realm where you will exist only as his protection. And when you are gone, he will choose another envelope, another life. Her form began to thin, fading into the lamplight. I am sorry, she said softly. Sorry that you were chosen. Sorry for the pain you carry. But you are the only one who can end this. The only one who can force him to face what he has done. Giant's voice shook. Will I see you again? If you succeed, Lynn said gently, I will finally rest, and you will finally live. Freedom waits on the same truth for us both. She reached up and touched his face one last time. Warm, real, impossibly tender. Do not surrender to fear, she whispered. Act, you are stronger than you think. Then she vanished. Only the jasmine remained, and the unbearable weight of what had to be done. Froze over the edge of the table, fingers hovering as if mid-motion, trembling slightly. His eyes searched Giant, wide with a mixture of fear and relief. You've come, Wenshin whispered, voice low, almost reverent. I've been waiting, but I didn't know if anyone would dare. I don't have time for waiting, Giant said, his voice firm though his chest thumped like a drum. It's about Lynn, about her death, about what her father did. Recognition and dread passed over Wenshin's face, etching lines of guilt deeper into his skin. He set down his brush fully, rising slowly, each movement careful, deliberate. I know, he said. I've known all along, but I could not speak, not without proof, not without confirmation that someone could withstand him. Giant reached into his pocket, feeling the envelope burn against his fingers. This is proof, he said, pressing the red paper into Wenshin's hand. I've been touched by him. I've seen what he's capable of. If you do not speak, I won't survive the night. The calligrapher's breath caught. He traced the gold characters with shaking fingers, reading and rereading them, his eyes flicking up to Giant, repeatedly, as if seeking reassurance that the words, the evidence, and the danger were all real. He is relentless, Wenshin murmured finally. If the truth comes to light, he will try to take you entirely. You must understand, the moment you confront this, you will not simply be asking for justice. You will be drawing his attention like a beacon. I understand, Giant said. Every instinct in him screamed to flee, but he did not move. I cannot let another life fall to him. I have to do this. For Lynn, for me, for anyone else he might choose. Wenshin's hands trembled as he nodded slowly, accepting the gravity of what was about to unfold. Then I will help, he said. I will speak, but you must follow me exactly, and we must move quickly. He will know the moment we begin, and when he knows, there will be no turning back. The room seemed to shrink around them, the scent of jasmine mingling with ink and old paper, heavy with anticipation. Giant swallowed, feeling the weight of the envelope, of Lynn's warnings, of the inevitable confrontation that loomed just beyond the city streets. Outside, shadows stretched and twisted, the wind whispering through narrow alleyways. The ghost was near, and Giant knew with every heartbeat that there would be no second chance. Began to tremble. I cannot speak of her, Wenshin said at last, his voice barely above a breath. I have a family to protect. I have already lost too much. He's trying to kill me, Giant replied, the words coming out sharper than he intended. He pulled the envelope from his pocket and set it between them like a challenge. Her father's ghost. I found this 3 nights ago without knowing what it was. Her family told me I was betrothed to her spirit. His jaw tightened. But Lynn came to me last night. She told me the truth. Her father murdered her. The ghost marriage wasn't about honoring her. It was about turning me into a scapegoat for his punishment. Wenchen stared at the envelope as if it might move on its own. The color seemed deeper here, darker, as though it had absorbed every confession spoken over it. When he finally looked up, there was no denial in his eyes, only fear and a weary kind of confirmation. Giant felt no triumph, no release. If anything, the pressure in the air grew heavier, as though the unseen world had taken offense at being named aloud. They had gone to the authorities, but the officer's bored expression and thinly veiled irritation had made one thing painfully clear. There would be no help from that quarter. What they were facing existed beyond paperwork and polite disbelief. They were alone. Wenchen's phone rang as they descended the steps of the station. He answered out of habit, his voice automatically courteous, the tone of a man who had spent decades surviving on reputation and respect. As he listened, the color drained from his face. "I understand," he said finally, each word measured. "Of course, thank you for letting me know." He ended the call and stood still, staring at the dark screen in his hand as if it were an accusation. "What is it?" Giant asked, though he already knew. "That was Mrs. Chen," Wenchen said quietly. "She's been commissioning the wedding invitations for her daughter's ceremony next month." A pause. She decided to use another calligrapher. She said she's heard I've been spreading strange stories about respectable families. She doesn't want bad luck associated with her daughter's marriage. They stood in silence as the city flowed around them. Shoppers, office workers, couples arguing softly, children tugging at their parents' hands. Ordinary lives, ordinary worries. People who had never touched a red envelope or felt the cold attention of the dead. "It's starting," Wenchen said under his breath. "This is how it begins. One customer, then another. Word travels fast in communities like ours. Reputation is everything in traditional businesses, and once it's damaged," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I'm sorry," Giant said. "This is my fault." "No," Wenchen replied, though the firmness wasn't there anymore. "This is the price of truth. I knew it would come." Over the following days, the unraveling of Wenchen's livelihood unfolded with grim precision. On Tuesday night, someone shattered his shop windows, scattering glass across the floor and over the carefully arranged samples of wedding invitations, symbols of joy reduced to debris. By Thursday, graffiti appeared on the walls, accusing him of being a liar and a fraud. The characters were exquisitely formed, so flawless they looked as though they'd been written by a master's hand. Then the customers stopped coming. No confrontations, no explanations, just empty hours and unopened doors. Whispers replaced conversations. Rumors about madness, about dangerous superstitions, about a man who had angered forces best left undisturbed. And beneath it all, like a slow, patient rot, the sense grew stronger that something was watching, waiting, and deeply pleased with the damage being done. Had been before. When Giant visited the ruined shop a week later, he found Wayne sweeping shards of broken glass into a dustpan. His hands trembled, not with terror now, but with bone-deep exhaustion. The kind that comes from standing too long against a tide you know will never fully recede. "I'm sorry," Giant said quietly. "This is my fault." "No," Wayne replied. His voice was steady, though his eyes were hollowed out by loss. This is the price of truth. I knew it would come, and I chose to pay it anyway. He paused, resting both hands on the broom handle. The only question is whether the payment was sufficient. Later, as they emerged from the police station, Giant noticed something had changed. The crushing pressure that had lived behind his eyes for weeks had eased. The air still felt charged, unsettled, but the immediate sense of being hunted had weakened. The envelope in his pocket felt cooler now, almost inert, as if whatever power animated it was slowly bleeding away. "What happens now?" Giant asked. "Now we wait," Wayan said. "The truth has been spoken. It exists in the world where it cannot be taken back. The spiritual binding should weaken. Her father's ghost will be forced to face what he did." He looked toward the street where people passed without noticing either of them. "It may take time, but the cycle has been broken." They parted at the bus station. Wayan returned to what remained of his calligraphy shop. Giant headed back to his apartment. With every step, the envelope seemed lighter, the jasmine scent fainter. More importantly, the presence of Lynn's father was retreating, as though dragged backward toward a reckoning long delayed. The release, when it came, was not sudden. The envelope vanished slowly over the course of several days. The money turned translucent, the red paper paling until it dissolved into nothing. The sense of malevolent attention withdrew, but it did not leave him unchanged. Something remained behind. An awareness, a sensitivity to the spaces between things. Lynn appeared to him one final time. She was no longer solid, no longer bound by the illusion of warmth and weight. She shimmered like heat rising from stone. "Thank you," she said, her voice already thinning. "You freed me from my father's rage." A pause, heavy with meaning. "But I cannot free you from what you have seen." "What do you mean?" Giant asked. She was fatting even as he spoke. "The door has been opened," she whispered. "You are marked now. You will always be able to see us, hear us, smell our presence." Her outline dissolved into light. "This is the price of surviving what should have killed you." Then she was gone. Only the faint trace of jasmine remained, and a silence heavier than the fear that had once filled it. In the weeks that followed, Giant learned the truth of her words. The immediate threat was gone, but the world had not returned to what it was. Shadows lingered too long. Empty rooms breathed. Certain places hummed with memory and grief. He was free, but never untouched. And sometimes, late at night, when the city grew quiet, he would catch the faintest scent of jasmine and know, deep in his bones, that some doors, once opened, are never meant to be closed again. Before, it was as if a veil had been lifted from his sight, revealing layers of reality most people were mercifully spared from ever knowing. Shadows slipped through his peripheral vision without casting a source. Whispers rode the wind, never forming words, yet heavy with warning. And on nights when exhaustion hollowed him out, the air would thicken with the sickly sweetness of jasmine, sometimes tinged with the metallic ghost of old blood. He took work as a night security guard. It fit him. Darkness no longer frightened him the way crowds did. Empty buildings were honest. People carried masks, places did not. Still, safe had become a flexible word. The dark held presences that watched him without hatred or mercy, studying him the way a predator studies something it hasn't yet decided to chase. Wayan's life did not recover. It unraveled. After the fire, no clear cause, no witnesses, his shop closed for good. His wife took the children and left the city. In the neighborhood, his name became a warning spoken in lowered voices. The calligrapher who lost his mind, who ruined his family with talk of ghosts and murder. When Giant visited him in the cramped apartment where he now lived alone, Wayan looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single season. Was it worth it? Wayan asked, pouring tea with hands that never quite stopped shaking. Giant hesitated. I don't know, he said at last. I'm alive, you're alive, the truth exists. Wayan stared out the window at brick walls and narrow alleys that let in almost no light. But is that enough? He asked softly. Giant had no answer. Some prices could only be measured after a lifetime, and even then the scales were never clear. A year later, during his rounds, Giant saw her through the lobby window. A young woman stood beneath a flickering streetlight, the same one where everything had begun. At her feet lay something red, bright against the wet pavement. Her posture told him everything. Desperation balanced carefully against calculation. His chest tightened. He left his post without hesitation, rode the elevator down and pushed into the night air. Don't touch it, he called, keeping his voice steady. It's not what you think. She looked up. Her eyes were wide, not with greed or curiosity, but terror. Not of the envelope. Of him. She backed away slowly, her gaze fixed over his shoulder. Giant felt it then, the familiar pressure, the cold attention settling into place. He turned. The street behind him was empty, too empty. The light flickered harder now, buzzing like an insect trapped in glass. The jasmine scent drifted in, faint but unmistakable. The woman ran. Giant did not chase her. He stepped toward the envelope instead and stopped a careful distance away. It lay there, waiting, patient, as if it had always known someone like him would come. He understood then. The cycle had not ended. It had only changed hands. Somewhere a door had been opened that could never be fully closed. And now, those who could see were the ones responsible for standing between the living and the debt of the dead. Giant stood beneath the streetlight, the city breathing around him, and wondered how many others like him already walked these streets, marked, watching, carrying burdens no one else could see. The envelope did not move, but it did not need to. It knew he was there. The man with haunted eyes and the scent of jasmine clinging to his clothes like a burial shroud stood before her. She felt it instantly, what he had become, what he carried, the invisible mark that set him apart from the ordinary world. Instinct screamed louder than curiosity. Stay away from me, she whispered. Then she ran, vanishing into the tangled arteries of the city. John remained beneath the flickering streetlight, watching her disappear. The red envelope lay where it had always been, glowing softly on the pavement, patient, expectant, waiting for the next desperate soul to notice it. He had broken one cycle. He had not ended them all. In saving himself, he had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. He was alive. He was free. But he no longer belonged entirely to the living, and he never would again. The jasmine scent followed him as he walked back to his building, faint, persistent, a reminder of what he had survived and what that survival had cost him. He was a ghost story, moving through human streets. In the small security office, surrounded by monitors showing empty hallways and silent rooms, John settled into his chair. He tried not to notice the shadows that shifted without bodies, the whispers that slipped from places where no one stood. He was safe, after a fashion, alive after a fashion, but the price of that safety was an isolation so complete that, on certain nights, he wondered whether the ghost marriage might have been the kinder ending. The envelope would find someone else. It always did, then another, and another. Cycles were never truly broken, only delayed by people like him. People willing to trade pieces of their humanity for small victories. People who learned too late that some battles could only be won by accepting a quieter, lingering defeat. Outside, the city slept beneath its canopy of electric stars, unaware of the predators that moved through its streets like sharks through dark water. And John kept watch, no longer fully human, not yet a ghost, a sentry standing between worlds, able to protect others only by warning them away from dangers they could see, and from the danger he himself had become. Story 2: The Choice That Was Stolen. The house had been empty for 7 years when Alina Hartwell stepped inside for the first time. The silence struck her immediately, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy sort, thick, watchful, as if the walls were holding their breath. Her footsteps didn't echo so much as disappear, swallowed by bare rooms that seemed to absorb sound instead of returning it. The real estate agent lingered near the door, keys clenched tightly in her hand. She had warned Alina more than once. 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, woods pressing in from all sides, no streetlights, no quick help. Her eyes kept flicking to her watch as if time itself felt unsafe here. Alina didn't mind. After the divorce, after the endless paperwork, the careful exchanges of their child at neutral locations, after a life broken neatly into halves, isolation felt like mercy. These walls would belong to her alone. No voices to argue with, no compromises, just quiet. The house was a colonial revival built in 1889, the kind of place erected by someone who believed permanence could be forced through craftsmanship alone. Wide plank floors stretched across rooms that smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The windows were original, their glass uneven, warping the outside world into slow-moving waves. A central staircase curved upward with a dignity modern homes never seemed to possess. Solid, confident, unapologetically old. The previous owner, Dorothy Crane, had lived here alone for 43 years. She died the previous winter. Natural causes, according to the paperwork. The estate sale had stripped the house of furniture and keepsakes, leaving only its skeleton behind. Alina bought the house with her father's life insurance money. She signed the papers on a Thursday morning while rain tapped impatiently against the lawyer's windows. 3 weeks later, she moved in with boxes that barely filled 2 rooms. The divorce had taught her what was truly essential. Mostly books, a handful of photographs, and her grandmother's china. Never used, never discarded. The house revealed itself slowly. Alina explored room by room, learning its moods, which floorboards creaked loudly and which whispered, how sunlight slanted through certain windows in the late afternoon, where shadows gathered even at noon. It was during her second week that the attic called to her. The access panel sat in the hallway ceiling, a simple square with a dangling cord. She pulled it down on a Tuesday afternoon when the house felt especially still, as if it were listening. The folding ladder unfolded with a groan that echoed longer than it should have. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light as she climbed. The attic stretched the full length of the house, its pitched roof forming a narrow tunnel of shadow and forgotten years. Most of it was empty. The estate sale had been thorough. But beneath a dormer window overlooking the woods, Alina found what had been left behind. A sewing basket, its wicker darkened with age. A bundle of letters tied with brittle ribbon, the ink too faded to read without effort. And tucked into a fold of yellowed fabric, a wooden shuttle. Alina lifted it carefully. It was heavier than it looked, warm, strangely so. The wood had been polished by decades of use, smoothed until it almost glowed. Boat-shaped, perfectly balanced, made to pass back and forth through waiting threads. As her fingers closed around it, the house creaked, not beneath her feet, but somewhere deep inside its bones. And for the first time since moving in, Alina had the unsettling feeling that she was no longer alone. The shuttle tapered elegantly to narrow points at both ends, hollowed through its center where thread would once have been wound and unwound thousands of times. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. Whoever had shaped it had known with the way a musician knows an instrument, not as a material to be forced, but as something to be listened to. The grain flowed naturally along the curve, uninterrupted, like water finding its own path. Tiny tool marks caught the light, so fine they seemed intentional, leaving texture where smoothness would have been easier. Alina turned it over in her hands, feeling an unexpected sense of calm. She had never cared much for crafts. Knitting, sewing, weaving, those were things her grandmother had done, not her. Yet the shuttle carried a strange gravity, purpose. It had been made for one task and had fulfilled it faithfully day after day, year after year. There was something comforting in that kind of certainty. Without quite deciding to, she slipped it into her pocket. She climbed down from the attic, leaving the sewing basket and the letters untouched. Those could wait. In the living room, she cleared a space on the mantel between two brass candlesticks inherited from her grandmother. When she placed the shuttle there, centered and precise, it looked right. The dark wood against the pale marble felt intentional, almost ceremonial, as though the house itself approved. As if it had been waiting. The first change came 3 days later. It was so small, so easily dismissed, that Alina nearly ignored it altogether. She had been dreading a call from her lawyer regarding the ongoing property dispute with her former neighbor, a petty argument over a fence line that had dragged on for months, generating nothing but bills and resentment. When the phone rang that Thursday morning, she answered with practiced exhaustion. Instead of more bad news, her lawyer sounded baffled. The neighbor had withdrawn the claim entirely. No negotiation, no settlement. A brief letter stating that he had been mistaken about the boundary and would remove the fence at his own expense. Alina sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The lawyer tried to sound casual. Sometimes these things resolve themselves, he said, but his voice betrayed unease. This wasn't how these disputes usually ended. After the call, Alina stood at the sink and stared out the window at the woods beyond her yard. Sunlight filtered through the trees in deliberate-looking patterns, branches casting shadows that felt arranged rather than random. Her gaze drifted, unbidden, to the living room mantel. The shuttle caught the light and reflected it softly, its surface seeming almost to breathe. A chill moved through her, not fear exactly, but awareness. The second change came the following week. And this time, Alina couldn't explain away the way it made her skin crawl. It started with people. A cashier at the grocery store waved her through when her card declined, smiling as if it were nothing. A teacher at her child's school suddenly agreed to adjust the custody schedule without argument. Even her ex-husband, always rigid, always defensive, spoke to her with an unfamiliar softness, conceding points he had once fought viciously over. Each interaction left her unsettled, rather than relieved. It wasn't gratitude she saw in their faces afterward. It was relief, as though some unseen pressure had been lifted from them and quietly transferred elsewhere. At night, the house began to sound different. Not louder, quieter. The creaks shifted locations. The staircase sighed when no one was on it. Sometimes Alina woke with the certainty that someone had been standing just outside her bedroom door, listening. She started dreaming of thread, endless lengths of it stretching through darkness, tangling around her wrists, pulling tight until she woke with her hands clenched painfully into fists. In the dreams, she was never weaving, only being woven. Each morning, the shuttle was still on the mantel, always centered, always warm. And slowly, inexorably, Alina began to understand that whatever order was being restored to her life was not free. It was merely being paid for elsewhere. David slept. His breathing evened out, slow and heavy, the sound of someone fully at rest. But Alina did not sleep. She lay rigid beside him, replaying that flicker of terror she had seen cross his face, the momentary rupture in whatever calm had been imposed on him. It reminded her of a swimmer surfacing unexpectedly, gasping for air before being pulled back under. The house creaked softly around them. Not the ordinary settling noises she had come to recognize, but something more deliberate. A floorboard sighed near the staircase. Somewhere downstairs, wood brushed against wood, the faintest sound of movement, as if something had been adjusted, aligned. Alina turned her head slowly and looked toward the bedroom door. It stood open, framing the darkness of the hallway. For a brief, irrational moment, she expected to see the shuttle resting there, upright on the floor, watching. It was, but when she checked the mantel the next morning, it was warmer than usual. David left early, kissing her cheek with a tenderness that felt rehearsed. He promised to call later, mentioned the coast again, spoke as though the future between them were suddenly obvious and settled. Alina smiled and nodded, playing her part, but unease gnawed at her long after the door closed behind him. The changes accelerated after that. People no longer merely agreed with her, they anticipated her. Colleagues deferred without discussion. Strangers stepped aside instinctively. Even difficult conversations seemed to resolve themselves before she had finished forming the words. It was as though resistance itself had been quietly edited out of her world. And yet every night, Alina dreamed of faces she did not know. Women mostly. Their eyes followed her from the corners of dark rooms. Their mouths opened as if to speak, but no sound came. Thread bound their wrists. Thread crossed their throats. Thread pulled tight until their forms blurred and unraveled into nothing. She woke each time with the smell of old fabric in her nose, dust, oil, something faintly metallic. David began to withdraw again, but differently now. When she spoke to him on the phone, there were pauses where his breathing changed, where she sensed him struggling against something invisible. Once, she heard him whisper her name, not affectionately, but like a question, like a plea. "Alina," he said softly, "do you ever feel like you're not alone in your own thoughts?" Her fingers tightened around the receiver. Before she could answer, his tone shifted, smoothing over. He laughed lightly, brushing it aside as stress, as imagination. The conversation slid back into safe, agreeable patterns. But Alina knew. That night she stood in the living room long after midnight, staring at the shuttle. The house felt alert, attentive. The silence pressed close, expectant. She reached out and touched the wood. Images flooded her mind, not memories but impressions. Women seated at looms, bent backs, quiet endurance. Lives measured in duty rather than choice. Threads passing through hands that had never been asked what they wanted, only what was required of them. She pulled her hand back sharply, heart pounding. For the first time since moving in, Alina felt something close to fear, not of the house, but of herself. Whatever the shuttle was doing, it was not granting wishes. It was redistributing burden. And slowly, inexorably, Alina began to understand the truth that lay beneath the comfort, beneath the ease, beneath the way the world had begun to bend around her needs. She was no longer choosing the shape of her life. She was being woven into it. And somewhere, she was certain of this, someone else was paying the price for her peace. More perfect than any reality she had ever experienced. When she ended the call, the silence rushed back in. It was thick, padded, the kind of quiet that swallowed sound rather than reflected it. Alina set the phone down and stood very still, listening to the house breathe around her. She realized then that the unease was no longer vague. It had a shape. People were not simply leaving her life by chance. They were being moved. That night she dreamed again of the loom, but this time she stood before it. The shuttle rested in her hands, heavy and warm, the thread already taut. On the other side of the fabric she could see silhouettes forming as the pattern grew. Faces emerged in the weave, David's, pale and strained. Brenda's, mouth open in a soundless cry. Others she didn't recognize yet, their features still blurred, still becoming. She woke with her fingers curled, as if gripping something that was no longer there. The realization settled slowly, inexorably, like a stitch being pulled tight. The shuttle did not act on its own. It responded, not to spoken wishes, but to unvoiced longing, to resentment never admitted, to exhaustion that whispered, "I just want this to stop." It took the quiet, selfish prayers Alina had never allowed herself to name and fulfilled them with merciless efficiency. Conflict removed, obstacles softened, difficult people redirected elsewhere. At a cost she did not pay directly. The house changed with her understanding, or perhaps she simply began to notice what had always been there. The walls felt closer at night, the shadows heavier. Sometimes she thought she heard the faint rhythm of movement above her ceiling, not footsteps, but the steady back and forth of something working, weaving. Alina tried to resist. She told herself she would not think those thoughts, that she would not allow relief when a problem vanished. But intention proved useless against habit. The shuttle did not require permission, only awareness. And awareness, once gained, could not be undone. David stopped calling. When she finally drove into town to check on him, his apartment was empty. The landlord told her he'd taken an extended leave, something about exhaustion, about needing to get away from himself. No forwarding address, no explanation. Brenda sent one last message weeks later, just 3 words sent at 3:17 a.m. "It won't let me." Alina stared at the screen until it went dark. That was the night she removed the shuttle from the mantel. She carried it back to the attic, each step heavy with dread. The ladder creaked beneath her weight, the air above thick with dust and the smell of old fabric. She placed the shuttle back where she had found it, nestled among the forgotten remnants of Dorothy Crane's life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the house exhaled, a sound like relief or disappointment. Alina descended the ladder and closed the panel behind her, sealing the attic away. She told herself it was over, that she had chosen differently, that she had reclaimed her life. But even as she stood there, she felt it. The subtle shift of tension, the thread not cut, merely slackened. Some nights when she lay awake listening to the woods press close against the windows, Alina imagined the shuttle above her, waiting for the next unspoken wish, waiting for the moment when loneliness outweighed conscience. because now she understood the truth Dorothy Crane had lived with for 43 years, alone in that house, surrounded by peace that had been purchased too dearly. She had never chosen this. But once the weaving began, choice was no longer the point. Her mother's voice had been warm, almost relieved, as she praised how settled Alina sounded. And when the call ended, Alina realized, slowly, uncomfortably, that she hadn't lied once. Nothing had been exaggerated, nothing softened. Her life truly was aligning with uncanny precision. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like being watched while undressing. In the weeks that followed, the good fortune stopped feeling accidental and began to feel managed. The house was the first to betray itself. One morning, while Alina stood at the kitchen sink, she saw the living room window move, not rattled by wind, not nudged by pressure. The sash lowered itself a fraction of an inch, just enough to seal the draft that had always slipped through. The motion was smooth, careful, like fingers finishing a task they had been meaning to complete. The hallway floorboard that had always chimed beneath her feet went quiet. When she knelt to inspect it, she found the nail head sunk perfectly flush, pressed deeper than before, as though the wood had been disciplined into silence while she slept. Then the world beyond the house followed suit. Her mortgage payment dropped after a clerical correction. Her car passed inspection despite every warning light insisting it shouldn't. At work, a promotion appeared without an interview, without discussion, complete with a salary increase that matched the exact figure she had once calculated in a private moment of wishful thinking. None of it felt earned. None of it felt human. These weren't solutions. They were edits. Clean, efficient removals of friction. The kind of perfection that erased not just problems, but texture, uncertainty, effort, consequence. Alina found herself grieving small irritations she had once cursed. The cold air sneaking through the window, the creak beneath her step, the quiet dread of waiting for bad news that proved she was still alive and participating. Each improvement arrived at precisely the moment her patience thinned. Too precise. It felt as though something stood just outside her life, studying it closely, making adjustments the way a tailor pins fabric, without asking whether the garment should fit that way at all. She began to watch the shuttle, at first casually, then compulsively. Each morning, her eyes went to the mantelpiece before anything else. Each night, she studied the dark curve of the wood, tracing the grain, searching for changes she couldn't quite name. Sometimes the surface seemed dull. Other times it caught the light with a slick, almost oily sheen that made her throat tight. She started to notice faint lines she didn't remember seeing before, marks that suggested patterns, intentional and repeating, like symbols worn smooth by use. Alina stopped touching it. She was no longer afraid of what it might do if she did. She was afraid of what it already had. Followed her through her increasingly flawless days. The shuttle never shifted from its place, yet evidence of movement began to appear everywhere else. The first sign was small enough to dismiss, a coil of silk thread resting on her kitchen counter, arranged with deliberate care. The thread was dyed a deep burgundy, the color of something long dried and long absorbed. When Alina lifted it, her fingers trembled. It had been woven into a tiny image, abstract at first glance, but unmistakable once it settled in her mind. A woman standing at a window, staring outward at something the thread refused to reveal. Alina threw it away. The next morning, there was another. This one lay beside her keys. The pattern showed a car overturned on a lonely stretch of road. The shape of the hood, the angle of the wheels, The small dent near the rear door. It looked like Brenda's car, or close enough that Alina's stomach turned cold. After that, the images came daily. They appeared on the coffee table, the bathroom sink, the passenger seat of her car. Always silk, always burgundy, always woven with impossible precision. At first, Alina thought they were warnings, premonitions stitched in thread. But as she studied them, a deeper horror emerged. Some of the images were not about what would happen. They were about what had. One morning, she found a woven picture pressed flat against her bathroom mirror. The sight of it made her knees give way. It showed a 7-year-old girl hiding in a closet, ear pressed to the door, listening to her parents argue about money in hushed, furious voices. The detail was unbearable. The worn fur of the stuffed rabbit clutched to the girl's chest, the exact pattern of the closet's wood grain, the way her hair fell across her face as she strained to understand words she was never meant to hear. Alina had never told anyone about that night. She had buried it so deeply that even memory treated it gently, skirting its edges. And yet here it was, extracted, preserved, and displayed, woven by hands she had never seen. She began to notice the pattern elsewhere. Janet learned of her mother's illness the morning after Alina found a thread image of a hospital bed. David's promotion was announced the day after a tiny scene appeared showing a younger man shaking hands with an older one beneath fluorescent office lights. But the focus was narrowing. The images turned inward. Her grandmother's hands guiding hers through dough, flour dusting the air like snow. Her first kiss, awkward, breathless, stolen behind the gymnasium wall. Her father in his final hospital bed, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch her face one last time. Each piece was more detailed than the last, more intimate, more invasive. They were no longer predictions or memories. They were proofs. Alina understood then that whatever was weaving these images did not merely observe time. It possessed it. Past, present, future. Nothing was private. Nothing was forgotten. Every moment of her life had been cataloged, preserved, and rendered into thread with patient devotion. The perfection around her was not kindness. It was ownership. Of her life, every private thought, every buried memory. The violation was total. Past, present, and future had all been stripped from her and repurposed, woven neatly into someone else's design. Alina stopped throwing the thread images away. Instead, she kept them. She hid them in a shoebox in the back of her bedroom closet, arranging them carefully, one beside the other, until they formed a quiet gallery of silk and prophecy. There were dozens now. She studied them late into the night, tracing the threads with trembling fingers, searching for rules, patterns, anything that might explain why some moments were chosen and others spared. It was during one of these restless searches that she climbed into the attic again. It was a Sunday morning, the kind where the house felt unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath. She carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through dust and shadow beneath the eaves. Tucked behind an old sewing basket, half hidden where the roof sloped low, she found a wooden crate she was certain had not been there before. Inside were papers, notebooks, loose manuscript pages, letters. They all belonged to Dorothy Crane, the house's previous owner. Alina carried the crate downstairs and spread its contents across the kitchen table, expecting recipes, grocery lists, the quiet artifacts of a life long gone. Instead, she found a manuscript. Dorothy Crane had been a writer. The title, written in careful, looping script, made Alina's hands begin to shake. The pattern. The opening pages told the story of a woman named Elena Hartwell who moved into an isolated house after a painful divorce. In the attic, she discovered a wooden shuttle. She placed it on the mantel. After that, her life began to fall into an unnaturally perfect order. Elena read in disbelief. The property dispute, the reconciliation with David, Brenda's sudden departure. Every detail was there, rendered with uncanny precision. The pages were dated 7 years before Elena had ever heard of the house. She read through the night, coffee cooling beside her, as she followed her fictional double through scenes that were both unfamiliar and devastatingly intimate. Dorothy wrote with the sharp attention of someone who understood life's smallest cruelties, the way fate could tighten its grip thread by thread. But it was deeper in the manuscript that Elena felt the blood drain from her face. On page 47, Dorothy had written. Elena paused in her reading, her coffee grown cold beside her, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. She realized with growing horror that she was not reading about someone like herself. She was reading about herself, and the thought that followed was not her own. Dangerous insight. Dorothy's final journal entries grew erratic, the handwriting tightening as if each word had been pulled from her with effort. She wrote that the shuttle no longer merely helped her see patterns, it began to complete them. When she held it, unfinished scenes seemed to resolve themselves. Characters stopped resisting. Lives fell into order. Too much order. She wrote of a creeping dread, of realizing that her stories were no longer inventions but selections. She was not imagining futures. She was choosing which existing threads to tighten and which to leave slack. The shuttle, she believed, was not a tool of creation but of alignment, nudging lives toward the shape they most easily surrendered to. Dorothy wrote that she tried to stop using it. The house resisted. She described doors closing on their own, drafts disappearing, small irritations smoothing away until life became unbearably, suspiciously calm. Friends changed. Opportunities appeared with unnatural precision. And beneath it all, the sense of being watched, not by something cruel, but by something meticulous. In the final entry, Dorothy wrote only 3 lines. The pattern does not want authors. It wants participants. I am tired of being useful. There were no entries after that. Elena sat at the kitchen table as dawn crept through the windows. The journals spread around her like evidence at a crime scene. Her life, Dorothy's life. 2 women separated by decades, stitched together by the same house, the same shuttle, the same terrible generosity of fate. Slowly, reluctantly, Elena's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece. The shuttle rested where it always had, smooth and unremarkable, catching the early light along its polished curve. For the first time, Elena understood the truth that had been pressing against her mind for weeks. The shuttle did not force choices. It removed friction. It took desire unspoken, half-formed, buried beneath guilt and doubt, and cleared the path until fulfillment arrived effortlessly. David became the man she wanted, not the man he was. Brenda was removed, not harmed, simply relocated. The house healed itself. Her life aligned, not toward happiness, but toward ease. And ease, Elena now understood, was not the same thing as freedom. With trembling hands, she lifted the shuttle from the mantel. The house was utterly silent. She felt it then, a subtle resistance, like holding a magnet close to metal. The sense of something leaning in, attentive, curious. She imagined threads stretching outward from the shuttle, vanishing into walls, into people, into time itself. She could keep it. Her life would continue to smooth itself into perfection. No sharp edges, no surprises, no pain she hadn't already agreed to forget. Or she could refuse. Alina carried the shuttle back up to the attic. She placed it inside the wooden crate, beneath Dorothy's journals, beneath the pattern, and closed the lid. Then she pushed the crate as far beneath the eaves as she could reach. Nothing dramatic happened. No scream, no shudder, no sense of victory. Only the quiet return of imperfection. That afternoon, the draft came back through the living room window. The hallway floorboard creaked again, singing its familiar, off-key note. David called to cancel dinner, distracted, ordinary, imperfectly himself. Alina sat alone in the living room, breathing deeply, feeling something she had not felt in weeks. Uncertainty, and beneath it, fragile and real. Relief. She did not know whether the pattern was broken or merely waiting, but for the first time since moving into the house, her thoughts felt like her own again, and she held onto that feeling tightly, knowing now how easily it could be taken, smoothed away, rewritten into something easier. Some stories, Alina understood at last, were meant to resist completion, and she intended to remain unfinished. A passage from Dorothy's final weeks made Alina's hands tremble as she read. I begin to suspect it is not merely weaving the story, but feeding on it. It consumes potential possibility itself. Every path not taken collapses into a single perfect thread. It starves on chaos and grows fat on destiny. Each choice erased, each alternative severed makes it stronger, more solid, more real. I wonder how long it has been hungry. I am no longer writing the story. I am only transcribing what the shuttle shows me. Alina Hartwell will come to this house. She will find what I have left behind. She will live out the pattern already woven into the wood. The story will finally have its ending. And it will be well fed. Alina sat motionless at the kitchen table as dawn crept through the trees beyond the windows. Dorothy's papers lay scattered around her like the remains of a meticulous crime. The shuttle rested on the mantelpiece 30 feet away, yet its presence filled the room, pressing against her chest like a held breath. She understood now why the manuscript had felt intimate, why her life had fallen into place with such unnatural grace. She was not living freely, she was performing, following a script written decades before she was born, guided by an object that had learned how to turn fiction into fact. Alina rose and crossed the room. She reached for the shuttle, meaning to remove it, to sever whatever connection bound her life to Dorothy's story. Before her fingers touched the wood, pain exploded through her hand, sharp, electric, absolute. Her arm went numb instantly, hanging useless at her side. When sensation returned, it did so violently, pins and needles flooding her skin. A thin red line had appeared across her palm, precise and shallow, as if something unseen had drawn a blade through the air. She had never made contact. The shuttle pulsed with warmth. Alina stared at the mark, then at the object itself, understanding blooming too late. Resistance was not part of the pattern. Refusal was simply another thread, anticipated, accommodated, consumed. Her hand closed around the shuttle. The house settled around her like an embrace. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Through the kitchen window, she saw David's car turning into the driveway, arriving at the exact moment required. He would come inside. He would find her surrounded by papers. He would ask what was wrong in the careful voice of a man who had been speaking lines written for him. She would try to explain. He would not understand. because the story did not require him to. As David's footsteps reached the front door, Alina felt the last loose threads of her life draw tight. The draft vanished. The house grew still. Somewhere deep within the walls, something finished a line it had been weaving for decades. And the pattern at last completed itself. Required his disbelief. She would show him the manuscript and he would offer reason in its place. Coincidence, suggestion, the human tendency to impose meaning on chaos. He would speak of selective perception, of how troubled minds search for patterns. His skepticism was not a flaw in the story. It was necessary. Without it, the pattern could not close. Alina opened the kitchen door and watched David approach along the gravel drive. Even from a distance, she could see his face assembling itself into concern, the expression already chosen for him months, years, before she had ever known his name. He was handsome, he was kind, and he was unreal, a character granted just enough awareness to mistake performance for free will. "Alina," he said, his voice carrying precisely the worried warmth required. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." She almost laughed at the accuracy of it. She had seen a ghost, the outline of her own future, written in careful detail by a woman long dead, a woman who had come to believe that stories were truer than the people trapped inside them. But laughter was not part of the pattern. So instead, tears came. They arrived easily, obediently, her body responding to emotional cues laid down by someone else's imagination. She heard herself speak with a desperation that sounded practiced, refined by revision. "David," she said softly, perfectly, "I need to show you something. I need you to help me understand what's happening." She led him to the kitchen table. Dorothy's papers lay spread across its surface like a map of a life already traveled. David read with earnest concentration, and Alina watched his face move through the required sequence. Confusion, concern, doubt, and finally, a gentle, sympathetic dismissal that hurt precisely because it was inevitable. "Alina," he said, reaching for her hand, "this is fiction. The similarities are strange, I'll admit that, but coincidences happen. People's lives follow patterns because people follow patterns." She wanted to argue, wanted to point out the impossibility of it all, the specificity, the timing, the thoughts predicted before she had finished thinking them. But the words would not come. This too had been written. Her frustration, her isolation, the terrible loneliness of knowing the truth while remaining unable to make anyone else see it. In the days that followed, Alina attempted every act of resistance she could conceive of, only to discover that her body no longer fully belonged to her. She took the shuttle from the mantelpiece and buried it deep in the woods behind the house, digging until her hands blistered and the soil swallowed the dark wood hole. As she walked back toward the house, she felt a certainty settle over her. Not fear, not hope, but something colder. The shuttle would return. And when it did, it would not be angry. It would be satisfied. Because every attempt to escape had already been accounted for. Every rebellion was just another movement in the weave. The story did not end when she fought it. The story ended when there were no more choices left to take. Throat closed, as if an unseen hand had found her windpipe and applied just enough pressure to remind her who was in control. The words dissolved before they could be spoken. When her voice finally emerged, it carried none of her intention. "David," she heard herself say gently, "I'm just tired. Can we talk later?" He agreed, of course. He always did. The story required his patience. That night, Alina lay awake while the house breathed around her. Not metaphorically, she could feel it. The slow expansion and contraction of walls, the subtle settling of beams in a rhythm too steady to be coincidence. When she closed her eyes, images formed unbidden in her mind. Threads tightening, excess fibers trimmed away, loose ends pulled cleanly into line. She understood then that the shuttle was no longer merely an object. It was an editor. Days blurred together. Alina stopped attempting open rebellion because the effort itself exhausted her. Resistance did not provoke punishment, it provoked correction. Her life continued to improve with merciless precision. Arguments resolved themselves before they could begin. Her work accolades multiplied. David grew more attentive, more perfectly aligned with her unspoken needs. The house itself adapted to her moods, light adjusting, temperature correcting, silence falling exactly when she required it. Nothing was wrong. And that was the horror. Alina realized that pain, conflict, and uncertainty had been removed not because they were cruel, but because they were inefficient. They introduced branching paths. They weakened the weave. The shuttle did not hate her. It depended on her. Her life, streamlined, perfected, stripped of contradiction, was its nourishment. She stopped finding new thread images after a while. There was no longer a need for warnings or previews. The future had narrowed to a single thread, smooth and unbroken. One evening, while dusting the living room, Alina caught her reflection in the darkened window. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman staring back. The face was calm, serene, beautiful in a way that felt curated rather than lived in. The eyes held no confusion, no edge of fear, only acceptance. That terrified her more than anything else. In the final pages of Dorothy Crane's journal, Alina found a sentence she had missed before, written so faintly it seemed more imagined than real. The story does not end with death, it ends with completion. Alina understood what that meant when she felt the first absence. It was small, a forgetfulness so minor she almost dismissed it. She stood in the kitchen one morning and could not remember the name of her childhood street. Later, she realized she could no longer picture her mother's face clearly. The memories weren't taken violently. They were edited out, trimmed because they no longer served the pattern. She wept then briefly, but even that grief faded quickly, smoothed into something quieter, something easier to carry. One night, Alina picked up the shuttle without pain. It rested in her palm, warm and familiar, as if it had always belonged there. She did not fight it. There was no longer anything left to resist with. Outside, the wood stood perfectly still. Inside, the house waited. Somewhere threads tightened, and the story at last was nearly finished. Imagined it perfectly. The ending was always Alina's life. Every sigh, every act of rebellion, every tear shed in frustration, it had been accounted for, woven into the pattern before she had ever set foot in the house. The shuttle had not only guided her days, it had authored them. Every thought, every desire, every gesture of resistance had been anticipated, recorded, and redirected to serve the story. Alina sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the weight of inevitability pressing down like a physical force. The silver thread image on her pillow seemed to shimmer in the dim light, whispering promises she could neither refuse nor escape. She could feel the story wrapping around her like a cocoon, beautiful and suffocating. She tried to speak aloud, to demand the narrative release her, but the larynx would not obey. Her own voice was no longer hers to command. It belonged to the manuscript, to Dorothy, to the shuttle. Even her tears seemed measured, falling in the rhythm required by the plot. At that moment, Alina understood the final horror. The shuttle did not merely feed on chaos or manipulate luck. It fed on life itself, on the lived experience of a human being. Each choice she believed was her own had been an illusion. Each emotion had been choreographed. The story had never been written for her. It had been written through her. And somewhere, in a place she could neither see nor imagine, the next shuttle waited. Its owner would never know they were stepping into a pattern already spun, a thread already set, a story that had begun long before they were born. Alina closed her eyes, feeling the silk-smooth weight of inevitability settle over her. She was not free. She was not alive in the way she had once understood life. She was the story, and the story would continue perfectly, endlessly, until the shuttle chose the next reader. The house sighed around her. The light shifted in impossible ways. Outside, the woods remained silent. And inside, Alina waited, part of a tale that had no author but itself, trapped in the perfection of inevitability. And some traps are woven with love and inevitability. She was no longer a victim of the story. She was the storyteller, the thread that connected past, present, and future. Every sentence she wrote resonated through time, a careful echo of Dorothy's vision and her own life intertwined. Alina set the shuttle back on the mantelpiece when the page was filled, its polished surface catching the pale November light. She could feel the pulse of stories waiting to be claimed, the hum of possibility vibrating through the carved wood. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying hints of lives yet to be touched, yet to be written. For the first time, Alina understood the truth of the shuttle. It did not enslave those who encountered it. It demanded that someone continue the pattern, shape the narrative, give the story its life. And in that realization there was freedom. She would always be marked by the past, the threads of Dorothy's life woven into her own, but she was no longer trapped. She was a guardian, a creator, a participant in a cycle that was both terrifying and magnificent. Alina leaned back in her chair, pen resting lightly in her fingers, and smiled. Outside, the November light filtered through the woods like threads of gold, weaving themselves into the house, into her hands, into the story. And as she wrote the final words of her chapter, she knew the story would continue, alive, perfect, and terrifyingly beautiful, through the next reader who would one day find the shuttle waiting for them. The pattern was unbroken. The story was eternal, and Alina, for the first time, was exactly where she needed to be. Exactly, that's the haunting heart of the story. The shuttle and the pattern aren't just objects or events, they're a paradox, a mechanism of control disguised as liberation. Every act of choice is predestined, every moment of apparent freedom a thread in a meticulously designed snare. And yet the trap is mesmerizing, seductive, and impossibly elegant, so much so that the trapped can't help but participate, thinking they are shaping their own destiny. It's the ultimate psychological cage. The more one struggles against it, the more deeply it integrates into their life, until resistance and submission are indistinguishable. The beauty lies in the illusion, the perfection in the inevitability. If you want, I can rewrite your ending paragraph to fold that line in seamlessly, making the conclusion even more chilling and poetic. Do you want me to do that?